The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
You've got trick-or-treaters in the Oval Office. You have, children, John Jr. playing in the White House recording room with the equipment.
Have you ever wondered what it was like to grow up in the White House? This year, the JFK Library opened a new special exhibit on the first children, Caroline and John Jr. And coming up next, we'll take an inside look at it with Museum Curator Janice Hodson, next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to JFK 35. When President John F. Kennedy became the 34th president to occupy the White House, he was also the first to bring a young family into the president's mansion in more than 50 years. As such, his family would also be the first to be under the new spotlight of a growing television audience and receive more scrutiny from print and photojournalists than ever before. In this episode, we'll speak with the JFK Library's Museum Curator Janice Hodson about all the new challenges facing the first family, particularly on balancing the interests of the public and the privacy of the family. But before we do that, we go to Long Island to talk to Joanne Morse. Miss Morse's voice is part of our new exhibit. When she was a very young girl, she was recruited to sing a song from the perspective of Caroline Kennedy. Now that song is in our archives and part of our First Children exhibit.
My daddy is president. We had a busy day.
The voice you hear isn't a young Caroline Kennedy, but little Joanne Morse. Morse was a first grader from New York who was chosen to sing as the young Kennedy for a pop record in the 1960s. And today, Joanne is far from little. She's now a retired teacher still living in New York.
I was a teacher for 30 years. I taught music here in Southampton. I was the director of music at the Sacred Heart's Basilica, which is a Catholic church in Southampton, which, by the way, Kennedy family used to come to a lot. And Jackie Kennedy grew up in East Hampton. And now I'm a very proud nana of two grandchildren, Naomi and Natalia.
Morse's youthful tune is part of the JFK Library's special exhibit on the first children in the Kennedy White House. You can hear her voice amidst other commercial ventures named after the family, from board games to commemorative plates and dolls, among other items. But how did Morse's voice end up on the title track of a pop record? The writer of the song, Emmanuel Vardy, had lived in her town when he was searching for the perfect voice.
And he had started off in a high school, and he thought that the girls' voices were just too mature and not what he was looking for. And he went down into the middle school and he thought the same thing. He even tried some professional children vocalists. And again, it wasn't the kind of voice he was looking for. So he ended up in kindergarten, where he found me. And I had never had any vocal training and hadn't even studied music, but I did like to sing. I always wanted to be Julie Andrews. And I used to sing all the songs of The Sound of Music.
Morse's parents couldn't believe it when her daughter had been selected to headline the record, and Morse herself remembers being awestruck by the experience.
And I remember the first day I walked into the recording studio when there was a full orchestra there. I had never even seen an orchestra, and I got to sing with them, and that was a remarkable experience for a little girl.
Soon, Vardy and Morse took the show on the road and ultimately in front of the bright lights of television.
Started off in shopping centers, and it went into later traveling in many areas of the country and singing my record. And then I ended up singing it on television. So yes, that was, amazingly, exciting for a little kid.
Right.
But at the same time, I was also just very normal. And every day I went to school, and I had a brother and a sister. My life was really revolved around my own family's life. So in some ways it was very present, but at the same time, no, it was also, I thought maybe I thought every little kid did things like that.
As the child playing America's first daughter, Morse said she had always wished to meet the girl she was portraying. but the best she could do was follow the first family in news magazines with the rest of the country.
I was always looking for pictures of she with her pony, whose name was Macaroni, and of course John, and he was so cute. Jackie Kennedy was so glamorous and beautiful, and of course John Kennedy himself was tall and handsome, and I thought they were the perfect family.
Moore said even as a first grader, it felt odd portraying the most famous daughter in the country.
Caroline was still the superstar. I realized I felt sometimes, I think, a little embarrassed by it, because I really thought, well, I'm not really Caroline Kennedy. I was brought up as a Catholic little girl, and we were always taught not to lie. And so I wondered if this wasn't a form of lying. As a little girl, I used to wonder that. Well, why isn't she singing the song?
In 1963, Moore said she, along with the rest of the country, would be changed forever by the news of President Kennedy's death.
We lost our innocence, and in my eyes, the nation took a big turn. And it was a very, very sad time. I often think her father would be so proud of her, and I'm sure she wishes that he were still here to see the wonderful woman she's grown up to be.
Moore said she was surprised when she got the call that her voice would again be heard singing the titular song, this time in a museum.
Well, it's very surreal. And of course, with all that went on in the Kennedy household, I'm flattered that you chose to incorporate the song into your exhibit. But it is sort of amazing to me that as I look back on so many years, that I was able to make a record like that, and with the subject being the President of the United States, I hope I did it justice.
Years later, Moore says the melody still makes her smile.
Oh, I loved the song. I thought it was really cute and cleverly written, and I did like it. And I loved singing it. I certainly loved singing it with the orchestra.
But she will be the first to admit today's young singers are at another level. As a longtime music teacher and vocalist, she said she appreciates the talented voices on TV from shows like Glee, The Voice, and American Idol.
I hear these little children with these spectacular voices. I'm very humbled by it, because I think, oh my goodness, these are children that can truly sing and truly have talent.
Before I ended my interview, I asked Morse if she'd sing the song once more, for old time's sake. And so the only other thing, I have a little bit of a request. I'm thinking of taking your sound and mixing it a little with you present day. If you don't mind, maybe singing the first couple of verses for me.
All right, I'll try.
Okay.
My daddy is president. We had a busy day. I'm learning the alphabet, A, B, F, K. I don't play house, I play the game of government, 'cause my daddy is the president.
At Daddy's first press conference, I made news, wearing Mommy's high heel shoes. And every time I make move, I'm under the conference table. My daddy is president. We make a happy pair. I go for my pony ride. He rides in his rocking chair. No matter what I do, it makes a news event. 'Cause my daddy is the president.
As you can probably tell from our last interview, there was a lot of focus from the public, media, and commercial interests when it came to the first children. And all of that is covered in our new special exhibit that will be open through January 2023. Joining me now is our Museum Curator Janice Hodson to tell us more about what to expect from this fascinating exhibit. So Janice, we're here to talk about the new special exhibit that just opened at the museum, First Children. Can you tell me start a little bit about what is this exhibit and what is it covering?
Well, the exhibit, the full title is First Children, Caroline and John Jr. at the Kennedy White House. So we're focusing on the Kennedy children, but there are some mentions of how Jacqueline Kennedy, in the way she tried to approach preserving her children's privacy in a very public arena, took some of her cues from some earlier first ladies. These kids were the youngest kids to be in the White House since the Theodore Roosevelt administration, and his kids were older. And there was a lot of attention paid to his kids, who were exceptionally rambunctious and made for really good copy. And when Jacqueline Kennedy and the kids moved to the White House in February 1961, Eleanor Roosevelt had already advised her in a letter that she'd be going into a goldfish bowl, which would be very hard, could be very hard on the family. So, Mrs. Kennedy, I think it's in her later oral histories, she mentions, kind of dreading going into the White House for that reason. And then, in the end, felt that it was their best time together because they were all together physically in the same place every day. And as a result, President Kennedy got to spend time with his children that he might not have done to the extent that he did, say, if he had remained a senator. So the exhibit looks at sort of the push-pull of, Mrs. Kennedy's desire to create a normal childhood for her kids, in the sense that the Kennedys were normal. They were not like everyday people, but giving her children some privacy, and that combined with the pressures from the public and the media to know more about the kids, because the public just, these kids were people that the public could identify with, especially, other parents, people with families, were very intrigued by the Kennedy children and were really interested. And of course, there was a media response to that. And the exhibit shows some of the ways that response took a form in the types of things that people felt compelled to send to the White House. Not only, heads of state who were visiting, who felt they should bring something for the kids, but, your everyday citizen, like mom and daughter in Los Angeles who made a couple of homemade piggy banks and sent them off with their congressman to make sure these things got to the White House, and made one for each kid. So it's how the different ways that interest manifested itself in material culture.
You mentioned that she tried to learn from past presidential families, Roosevelt's beforehand. But this was different. It had been a long time since those families were around, and the 1960s with the advent of television becoming sort of ubiquitous. What were the unique new challenges that Mrs. Kennedy was facing when she moved into the White House?
It was definitely, just a broader media demanding, footage, demanding images, demanding interviews, demanding information. During Theodore Roosevelt's, administration, you had the news media, you had, daily newspapers, you did have periodicals. There were far more periodicals by the 1960s, and you had both generalized periodicals and specific focused periodicals. So you had the Kennedy kids on the cover of anything from Newsweek magazine to, trashier types of tabloid magazines. And it was that exposure in particular that Mrs. Kennedy was upset by. I mean, during Theodore Roosevelt's time, film, had been developed, motion picture film. So you would see, to my knowledge, there are certainly images of footage of TR giving speeches, but I'm not really aware of any type of film footage of his children. The Kennedys, you had film, but then you had television. And by 1960, the majority of households in the United States had a TV. And whereas 10 years before, households with television were in the minority. So here was a whole other, form of media that would project, moving images of the Kennedy children into people's living rooms. So there was an immediacy to that, and combined with, the identification that these people felt with the Kennedy family itself as being, here's, JFK was a veteran, and, in 1960, many of the heads of families, young families, had fought in World War II as well. So he's got the wife, he's got 2 kids, 2 young kids, and, it was just something that it just captured the public's imagination. And there were many more ways for the public to get exposure to the kids in 1960.
And because there was so much of this exposure, probably much more so than in any previous presidential family, even in the campaign, the family itself, the family unit became part of the campaign. I think today we're used to that. We're used to seeing, presidents do photo ops with their family, but this was kind of new territory. And so what was that like, and how was that a struggle for Mrs. Kennedy, who wanted to, balance the public life and their private life?
Well, there are memos in the exhibit that illustrate very well how, sort of in an unfiltered way, because they're internal memos that she was handwriting, sometimes typing, to her personal, her secretary. Sometimes these were passed on to Pierre Salinger, who was President Kennedy's press secretary, and by, late, I think it is, in 1962, she's writing, tell anyone who asks that, no, we're not telling people what the kids want for Christmas this year. We're not telling them about their birthday parties. We're not telling them anything. When your job is to keep the kids out of the newspapers entirely, which pretty much was an impossible task. So, she did things like, when her daughter Caroline became of school age, a little nursery play group that Kennedy had created became a formal school with qualified educators running it, in which there were children who attended who were the same age as Caroline and were known to her because they were, for the most part, the children of friends of the Kennedys, and they paid for the teacher's salary, they paid for the supplies, and the school existed within the White House on the 3rd floor. And it was a way of trying to create some semblance of a normal school environment, but within a protected, enclosed space where the media couldn't get to the kids. I said that the family moved in to the White House in February of 1961. By April 1961, the Kennedys are publicly stating in the media that they do not want, they're prohibiting photographers from trying to photograph the children while they were playing on the lawn of the White House, through the fence that surrounded the ground. And just reactions to things that she felt were being done that she considered exploiting her kids. the situation with Von Meter, who had recorded the first Family album, which Jacqueline Kennedy was no fan of, but she was willing to, kind of let it slide until Von Meter, was doing appearances on the Ed Sullivan Show and bringing, Caroline's name or John Jr.'s name into his skits. I mean, she wanted none of that.
And Von Meter, just for those who aren't aware, he was sort of a stand-up comedian type of his time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
This is sort of like today, if we looked at like Daily Show or political satire, this was early political satire for the 60s.
Yeah, and there had always been, in editorial cartoons, certain humorous criticism of presidents, but it was pretty much confined to presidents. It didn't extend to the families, and it also wasn't in a medium like television. Stand-up comics prior to JFK were not really using the presidents as material. So when Von Meter did this in 62, I think his album was released, there were people who were upset by it beyond Jacqueline Kennedy. Apparently, President Kennedy really didn't have much of a problem with it. And if you listen to it today, you can hear the full album on YouTube, and it's very gentle, but because it was perceived that Von Meter was kind of wading into an area that a lot of Americans were uncomfortable with. There was some pushback, although the album was a big seller. So there was, so the popular interest, I guess, outweighed those who objected to it.
Thinking about Mrs. Kennedy and everything that you've just talked about what she faced, did the way she approached the media, the public, all this publicity, all this attention sort of ripple across the future presidents and the future families that would come after her? Did people draw on her example like she drew on others?
Definitely. I think it's fairly well known that Hillary Clinton had contacted Jacqueline Kennedy just informally to talk about how she protected her children from the media. And, by the Clinton era, I mean, it's much more vicious. I mean, nasty vicious with some of the things that were said about Chelsea Clinton by so-called adults. And that example kind of filtered down to the Obamas. And so, yes, it definitely had an impact.
Well, that's really interesting. And you're right. It certainly was very different time by the time you got to Hillary Clinton, President Clinton, or President Obama. We have time for one more question. And really, I just want you to describe, I got to tour the exhibit a few weeks ago. And what really struck me was just these photos, these behind-the-scene photos of the White House that some people had seen that were released at the time, but many others that were taken for family use, but only now in this exhibit they're displayed. They may have been displayed in books or things that had been written about the children in the past. But when I walk through, this is a chance for people to see some really cool moments. Do you want to talk about a few of them?
Yeah, some of the images we have, the majority of them were taken by the White House photographers, and they weren't necessarily meant for public consumption. I mean, they are on the library's website if you look in our, browse our archives, but they have a certain informality to them. They are basically the president's equivalent of, the casual family snapshots, and we have some home movies. They just happen to be taken on the grounds of the White House by professional photographers who are employed by the White House. And so we selected some of the ones that seem to, more intimate ones that kind of reflect your average person would see in their own family albums, like Caroline and John Jr. dressed in their Halloween costumes and going to see their father. He just happens to be in, work in the Oval Office. So you've got trick-or-treaters in the Oval Office. You have, children, John Jr. playing in the White House recording room with the equipment. You have, the image that most people know, which was done actually for a Life magazine shoot of the Stanley Tredick image of John Jr. playing under the Resolute desk while JFK is working. We didn't use that one because it's so well known, but there's a more informal image done by one of the White House photographers of Caroline under the desk. But we do have some of the Tredick images as well, which have a certain informality, but those, interestingly, were meant for public consumption. They were taken with the intent that they were going to be published in the pictorials of the time, Life, Look, those things. And so you have this interesting dichotomy between the seriousness sometimes of what's going on with Kennedy and his advisors in the Oval Office with, in the background here's this little kid who's laughing and playing under a desk. There's one other image that also was done for media consumption, taken for media consumption. Caroline and her father having breakfast together, and actually it predates the presidency. It was taken when they were living in Georgetown when he was still, Kennedy was still a senator, but it reflects a routine that continued into the White House, where every morning Caroline would go to her father's room while he had breakfast and sit with him. And that continued into the White House. Mrs. Kennedy remembers this in her oral histories. Usually the routine was then, after Kennedy had his breakfast, went through some papers, he'd walk to the Oval Office and Caroline would accompany him. Later on, John Jr. would as well. So there's, even with the photographs that were taken by staff photographers for Life or Look that were meant to be part of, feature articles on the president and his family, they still have that informal, intimate quality to them.
Janice, I really enjoyed the exhibit. I think you and the rest of the staff did a great job. For those of you wondering, the exhibit will be open through the end of 2022 into the first week of January 2023, so there's plenty of time to go see it. And I do believe there'll be a virtual tour for those who can't make it to the library but can actually experience one-on-one tour with you, Janice, the curator, later on our website. So a lot of things for people to look forward to. And Janice, thanks for your time today and talking about the exhibit.
Okay, thanks, Matt.
Thank you for listening to this episode of JFK 35, a podcast from the JFK Library Foundation. We hope you can visit our library to check out the new exhibit, but if not, we will have a virtual tour of the First Children exhibition available online later this year. Visit our podcast page at jfklibrary.org/JFK35, where we'll have more information on topics mentioned in this episode. And if you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or tweet at us at JFK Library using the hashtag JFK35. And if you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great week.